On the morning of May 29th, 1453, after 53 days of siege, the walls that had protected the city of Constantinople for over 1,000 years finally gave way, and with them fell the last remnant of the Roman Empire, an empire that had endured in some form for nearly 1,500 years, since the days of Augustus Caesar. In its place rose a new power that would dominate the eastern Mediterranean for centuries to come. This is the story of the fall of Constantinople, the 21-year-old sultan who was determined to take it, the emperor who chose to die defending it, and the massive cannon, the secret chain, and the desperate final hours that decided the fate of one of history's most legendary cities. By the middle of the 15th century, Constantinople was, in truth, a shadow of its former glory. Once the capital of the mighty Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of the old Roman Empire that had continued unbroken for 1,000 years after Rome itself fell to Germanic invaders in the 5th century, the city had, by 1453, been reduced to little more than a fortified capital surrounded by the vastly larger and more powerful Ottoman Empire, which by this point controlled almost all of the former Byzantine territories in the Balkans and Anatolia. The city itself, protected by its legendary defensive walls, remained formidable, but its population had dwindled dramatically from a medieval peak of several 100,000 to perhaps 50,000 people, and its once vast treasury and military had been hollowed out by centuries of war, plague, and the catastrophic sacking the city had suffered at the hands of fellow Christians during the Fourth Crusade in 1204, an event from which Byzantine wealth and power had never truly recovered. The Byzantine emperor at the time of the final siege was Constantine XI Palaiologos, a man in his late 40s who had come to the throne in 1449 after the death of his brother John VIII, inheriting an empire that by that point consisted of little more than the city of Constantinople itself and a scattering of remaining territories in the southern Peloponnese. Constantine was, by most accounts, a capable and personally courageous ruler, a soldier emperor who had spent years fighting to defend what remained of Byzantine territory in Greece before assuming the throne, and who understood with clear-eyed realism the desperate odds his empire now faced. In the years before the final siege, Constantine had made repeated, increasingly urgent appeals to the states of Western Europe for military assistance, appeals complicated by centuries of religious schism between the Orthodox Christian Byzantines and the Catholic states of the West, a division that had hardened since the Great Schism of 1054, and that many in Western Europe still resented deeply because of the humiliations of the earlier Crusades. In a final desperate bid for Western military support, Constantine had agreed in 1452 to a formal union between the Orthodox and Catholic churches, a controversial move intended to satisfy the Pope and unlock promised assistance from Catholic Europe, but one deeply unpopular among much of Constantinople's own clergy and population, many of whom viewed submission to Rome as a betrayal of their faith, even in the face of existential military threat, with one prominent Byzantine official reportedly declaring he would rather see the Turkish turban ruling in the city than the Latin mitre, a sentiment that captured just how divided and demoralized the city's own population remained even as the Ottoman army approached its gates. In the end, The promised Western military support that Constantine had hoped his concession would secure largely failed to materialize in any meaningful strength, leaving the city to face its final trial with only a small number of foreign volunteers, most notably from Genoa and Venice, standing alongside its own depleted forces. Facing him was Sultan Mehmed II, ruler of the Ottoman Empire, who had come to the throne for a second and final time in 1451, at just 19 years old, following the death of his father Murad II. Mehmed was an unusually intense and driven young ruler, fluent in multiple languages, deeply read in both Islamic and classical learning, and reportedly obsessed from a young age with the ambition of conquering Constantinople, a goal that had eluded Ottoman sultans for generations despite repeated attempts stretching back over a century, including a previous unsuccessful siege by his own great-grandfather Bayezid I. Upon taking the throne, Mehmed moved with remarkable speed and single-mindedness to prepare for a final, decisive assault on the city, a project that would consume the first years of his reign almost entirely. Mehmed's preparations were extraordinarily thorough. In 1452, he ordered the construction of a massive fortress called Rumeli Hisari on the European shore of the Bosphorus Strait, directly across from an existing Ottoman fortress on the Asian side, together allowing Ottoman forces to control all shipping traffic through the narrow waterway, and effectively cut Constantinople off from potential naval reinforcement or resupply from the Black Sea. The fortress was built with astonishing speed, completed within a matter of months using a workforce of thousands of laborers, and its cannons soon demonstrated their seriousness of purpose by sinking a Venetian ship that attempted to defy the new Ottoman blockade, an act that left little doubt about Mehmed's intentions. Perhaps the single most decisive element of Mehmed's preparation involved artillery, and here the story turns to a Hungarian engineer named Orban, a gun founder who had reportedly first offered his considerable talents to the Byzantine Emperor Constantine, who lacked the funds to properly employ him, before turning to Sultan Mehmed instead, who possessed both the resources and the ambition to make full use of his skills. Under Mehmed's patronage, Orban designed and cast a series of massive bronze cannons, including one legendary gun, sometimes called the Basilica, so enormous that it reportedly required as many as 60 oxen and several hundred men to transport it overland to Constantinople, moving at a pace of only a few miles per day along specially prepared roads, and could fire stone cannonballs weighing hundreds of pounds, capable of shattering even the ancient and formidable Theodosian walls that had protected the city for 1,000 years, walls that had successfully repelled every previous siege in the city's long history, precisely because no attacking force had ever possessed artillery powerful enough to breach them directly. The great cannon itself proved difficult and dangerous to operate, requiring hours to reload between each thunderous shot, and needing to be cooled with oil after firing to prevent the barrel from cracking under the tremendous heat and pressure of each discharge. A reminder of just how experimental and unreliable this new era of gunpowder siege warfare still remained, even as it began to render centuries-old fortifications obsolete. Constantinople's defenses, though undermanned, were not without their own notable strengths. The Theodosian walls themselves, built in the 5th century under Emperor Theodosius II, formed a formidable triple line of fortifications stretching across the base of the peninsula on which the city sat, considered among the most sophisticated defensive works in the medieval world. The city's other flanks were protected by the waters of the Sea of Marmara, and crucially, the Golden Horn, a natural harbor protected by a massive iron chain that Byzantine defenders stretched across its entrance, physically blocking enemy ships from sailing directly into the harbor and threatening the city's more vulnerable seawalls along that stretch. Recognizing the desperate scale of the threat, Constantine also secured crucial outside help in the form of Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, a Genoese nobleman and experienced military commander who arrived in Constantinople in January 1453 with a force of several hundred professional soldiers at his own expense. A contribution that proved so valuable that Constantine placed him in overall command of the city's land defenses, a mark of the trust the emperor placed in this foreign volunteer, even as the vast majority of the defenders under his command were themselves native Byzantines, Venetians, and Genoese fighting alongside their Greek hosts. In total, the defenders of Constantinople numbered perhaps 7,000 to 8,000 fighting men, an almost impossibly small force tasked with defending walls stretching for miles. Against an Ottoman army, historians estimate it somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 soldiers, a disparity in numbers that made the eventual outcome, in retrospect, difficult to see as ever having been in serious doubt, however heroic the resistance that followed. The siege began in early April 1453, as Ottoman forces surrounded the city by land while Ottoman ships blockaded it by sea, and Mehmed's massive cannons began a relentless bombardment of the ancient walls, a process that, unlike the swift breaches of later artillery warfare, required sustained and repeated pounding over many days to gradually crumble sections of the ancient fortifications, sections the defenders worked desperately, often through the night, to repair with makeshift barriers of timber and rubble faster than the Ottoman guns could reopen them. One of the more remarkable episodes of the siege involved the defenders' own ingenuity at sea. On April 20th, 1453, a small flotilla of 4 Christian ships, 3 Genoese vessels, and 1 Byzantine ship, laden with grain and supplies, managed to fight their way through the Ottoman naval blockade in a fierce and closely watched battle, successfully reaching the safety of the chain-protected harbor despite being vastly outnumbered by the Ottoman fleet arrayed against them. A stinging tactical embarrassment for Mehmed that reportedly provoked considerable anger from the young Sultan toward his naval commander. Frustrated by his fleet's inability to breach the chain protecting the Golden Horn, Mehmed executed one of the most audacious engineering feats of the entire siege. In a single night in late April 1453, Ottoman engineers constructed a greased wooden track overland along a route bypassing the fortified chain entrance entirely, and using this track, along with teams of oxen and enormous manpower, transported a fleet of some 70 Ottoman ships overland from the Bosphorus directly into the waters of the Golden Horn itself. An operation of staggering logistical ambition that stunned the Byzantine defenders when they awoke to find an entire enemy fleet suddenly floating in waters they had believed completely secured behind their chain, forcing them to stretch their already desperately thin garrison even further to defend this newly exposed stretch of the city's seawalls. As the siege dragged into its final weeks in late May, both exhaustion and desperation mounted on both sides of the walls. Mehmed's own council was reportedly divided, with some advisors urging him to abandon the costly siege, given the unexpectedly stubborn resistance, and consider negotiated terms, while others, along with Mehmed's own fierce personal determination, pushed for one final, all-out assault to settle the matter decisively. Constantine, for his part, received at least one offer from Mehmed to spare his life and allow him to depart the city safely. An offer historical accounts suggest the emperor refused outright, reportedly declaring his intention to die defending his city rather than abandon it or his people. As the siege wore on through May, an atmosphere of dread and portent settled over the city's exhausted population, deepened by a series of events widely interpreted at the time as ominous signs. A lunar eclipse on the night of May 22nd, turning the moon a dark, blood-colored red, seemed to fulfill an old prophecy, holding that Constantinople could never fall while the moon was full, a prophecy many citizens had clung to for reassurance, and that now seemed instead to foretell disaster. Days later, a sudden and unexplained thick fog settled over the city, followed, according to numerous accounts from the time, by strange lights reported flickering around the dome of the Hagia Sophia itself, phenomena that spread panic through a population already convinced they were witnessing the final days of their ancient empire, and that some modern historians have speculated may have had a natural explanation, though none was apparent to the frightened citizens who witnessed them at the time. Mehmed committed to a final massive assault, launched in the pre-dawn hours of May 29th, 1453. Sending waves of troops against the battered walls in a carefully structured sequence intended to exhaust the defenders progressively. The first wave consisted of irregular troops, the Bashi bazooks, sent forward largely as a means of wearing down defenders and absorbing initial casualties. A second wave of more disciplined Anatolian troops followed, pressing the exhausted Byzantine and allied defenders even harder. The decisive third wave consisted of the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite and highly disciplined infantry corps, recruited and trained from childhood, specifically for the Ottoman military, who pressed the assault with a ferocity and coordination the defenders, by this point nearing complete physical exhaustion after weeks of continuous fighting and repair work, with little rest, found increasingly difficult to withstand. The battle's decisive turning point came when Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, whose leadership had held the defense together through weeks of siege, was severely wounded, struck, according to most accounts, by either a crossbow bolt or gunfire that penetrated his armor. Giustiniani, in tremendous pain and bleeding heavily, was carried from the walls for medical treatment, a decision that, whatever its medical necessity, had a devastating effect on the morale and cohesion of the troops he commanded, many of whom began to waver and retreat upon seeing their commander removed from the field at the very height of the assault. Compounding this crisis, Ottoman forces discovered, whether by chance or through a failure of the defenders to properly secure it, a small postern gate called the Kerkoporta, left unlocked in a section of the walls, allowing a group of Ottoman soldiers to slip through and gain a foothold inside the city's defenses, raising Ottoman banners on the walls in a moment that further shattered the confidence of the already faltering defenders, who, seeing enemy flags flying above what they had believed to be secure fortifications, began to break and flee in growing numbers along multiple sections of the wall nearly simultaneously. Emperor Constantine XI, upon recognizing that the city's defenses were collapsing beyond any hope of recovery, reportedly cast aside the imperial insignia that would have identified him as the emperor, and led a final desperate charge into the advancing Ottoman soldiers alongside his remaining loyal companions, choosing, as he had reportedly vowed, to die fighting rather than survive the fall of his city. His body was never conclusively identified afterward, amid the chaos and slaughter that followed, giving rise in the centuries since to enduring legends among Greek populations that the last Roman emperor had not truly died, but had been turned to marble and hidden away by an angel, waiting for the day he would awaken to reclaim his city. A poignant folk legend that speaks to the profound and lasting trauma the city's fall inflicted on Greek and Orthodox Christian memory for generations afterward. Once Ottoman forces breached the walls in force, the city descended into the traditional and brutal customs of siege warfare common to the era. 3 days of sanctioned looting and pillaging that Mehmed had promised his soldiers as their reward for the siege's hardships, resulting in widespread violence, enslavement, and destruction across the city. Historical accounts describe thousands of residents killed in the initial hours of chaos, and thousands more, by various contemporary estimates, captured and sold into slavery in the days that followed. A fate that befell people across every level of Byzantine society, from ordinary tradesmen and their families to members of the old aristocracy themselves. Among the notable casualties of the fall was much of Constantinople's remaining artistic and architectural heritage, with soldiers stripping precious metals, icons, and relics from churches across the city, including the desecration and looting of the magnificent Hagia Sophia, for nearly 1,000 years the greatest cathedral in Christendom, where thousands of terrified residents had taken shelter, believing, based on ancient prophecy, that divine intervention would save the city at its final hour, only to be captured or killed when Ottoman soldiers broke through the cathedral's doors. Mehmed himself entered the fallen city in the afternoon of the same day, and according to widely repeated accounts, rode directly to the Hagia Sophia, where he ordered an immediate halt to further looting within the building and had it converted into a mosque, a transformation that would define the building's function for nearly 5 centuries afterward. A symbolic act that captured something essential about Mehmed's broader approach to his new conquest, not simply destruction, but deliberate transformation and succession, positioning himself and the Ottoman state as the rightful inheritors of the fallen empire's imperial legacy, rather than merely its conquerors. Mehmed adopted the title Kaiser I Rum, Caesar of Rome, and Constantinople, soon renamed Istanbul in common usage, though the older name persisted officially for some time, became the new capital of the Ottoman Empire, a role the city would continue to hold for the remainder of the empire's existence, more than 4.5 centuries into the future. Mehmed adopted the title Kaiser I Rum, Caesar of Rome and Constantinople, soon renamed Istanbul in common usage, though the older name persisted officially for some time, became the new capital of the Ottoman Empire, a role the city would continue to hold for the remainder of the empire's existence, more than 4.5 centuries into the future. In the years immediately following the conquest, Mehmed pursued a deliberate policy of repopulating and rebuilding his devastated new capital, forcibly resettling populations from other conquered territories into the city while also inviting Greek, Armenian, and Jewish communities to return and rebuild their lives and businesses there, granting the Orthodox Christian population, through a newly appointed patriarch, a recognized status and degree of religious autonomy within the Ottoman state. A pragmatic policy that helped restore Constantinople within a generation to something approaching its former status as one of the great cosmopolitan cities of the world, even as it now stood at the heart of a very different empire than the one it had served for over 1,000 years before. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves across Europe, extinguishing, once and for all, the final direct continuation of the Roman Empire that had endured through the Byzantine successor state for nearly 15 centuries since the days of the ancient Roman emperors, and confirming the Ottoman Empire as an undeniable and permanent major power, squarely within the heart of what had previously been considered Christian Europe's own sphere. The event is often cited by historians as one of the traditional markers separating the medieval period from the early modern era, both for its symbolic finality in ending the ancient Roman imperial line and for its more practical consequences, as the fall disrupted established overland trade routes to Asia that had long passed through Byzantine and now Ottoman-controlled territory, providing significant additional motivation for the era of European maritime exploration that would soon follow, as European powers, and in particular Portugal and Spain, sought new sea routes to the riches of Asia that bypassed Ottoman-controlled territory entirely, a search for alternate passage that would, within just a few decades, lead directly to Christopher Columbus's own fateful voyage west across the Atlantic Ocean. For the Byzantine Greek population that survived the fall, the following decades brought profound dislocation, with many scholars, artists, and intellectuals fleeing westward into Italy, carrying with them manuscripts and knowledge of classical Greek learning that many historians credit as a significant contributing influence on the flourishing of the Italian Renaissance, already gathering pace in cities like Florence and Venice during these same decades. Constantine XI, the last Roman emperor, remains to this day a figure of profound significance in Greek national memory, honored as a symbol of heroic, doomed resistance against overwhelming odds. A ruler who, by every account that survives, chose to share the fate of his city and his people rather than save himself, bringing to its final dramatic close a Roman imperial story that had begun nearly 1,500 years earlier and ended at last on a blood-soaked May morning at the walls of a city he refused to abandon. And that was the fall of Constantinople, a siege that lasted just 53 days, but marked the end of an empire that had survived for nearly 1,500 years. For some, it was the tragic end of the Roman Empire. For others, it was the beginning of the Ottoman Empire's golden age. One city, one battle, and two completely different perspectives that continue to shape history today. Here at the Retro Review, we don't tell you what to believe. We simply revisit the moments that changed the world and invite you to decide what they truly mean. Do you think the fall of Constantinople could have been prevented? Or had the Byzantine Empire's fate already been sealed long before 1453? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this journey into history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and suggest the next historical event you'd like us to explore. Until next time, keep looking to the past, because every chapter of history still has something to teach us.